They thought they could steal everything from me. My peace, my home, even my private island. The HOA, backed by greedy officials, showed up one day and built 15 massive commercial buildings on my land, without a single word of permission. They said it was part of community expansion. But what they didn't know was that I had been watching them all along. Every blueprint, every fake signature, every secret meeting. I had already set a legal trap buried deep in the paperwork they thought I'd never read. So when they tried to take what was mine, they walked straight into it. And what happened next would expose one of the biggest land frauds in the state's history. This is a story of how one man outsmarted an entire HOA empire and turned their greed into their downfall. Stay till the end, because the way this story ends will leave you speechless. For most of his adult life, Daniel Reed had lived quietly along the coast of Clearwater Bay, a serene stretch of ocean where the world still seemed untouched by chaos. Just a few miles off the shore sat his pride and joy, a small, privately owned island that had been in his family for generations. It wasn't a massive plot of land, but it was perfect. Lush green palms, a crescent-shaped beach, and a single cabin built by his grandfather decades ago. That island wasn't just property. It was legacy. Daniel had no intention of selling it, ever. Not to developers, not to investors, and certainly not to the local HOA that had recently begun expanding its reach across Clearwater. The HOA, officially known as the Clearwater Lakes Community Association, had already swallowed up several neighborhoods on the mainland. Their glossy brochures promised community harmony and coastal luxury, but locals knew better. The HOA was infamous for their aggressive tactics, constant fees, and ruthless enforcement of their so-called rules. It started small, flyers in Daniel's mailbox, polite letters suggesting he could consider integrating his island into the new HOA jurisdiction. The letters used warm words: partnership, shared progress, community vision. But Daniel knew those were just corporate phrases hiding something more sinister. He ignored them. Weeks later, more letters came, this time with firmer language, implying that the association had developmental interests in the area and wanted to ensure environmental compliance. It was a veiled threat, but Daniel didn't bite. He had owned the island outright, with a title deed dating back to 1958, registered and verified. He didn't need their approval for anything. But apparently, the HOA didn't take no for an answer. Months passed. Summer arrived, and Daniel noticed small boats occasionally circling near his island. Men in reflective vests took pictures, measured the shoreline, and even set up stakes on the northern end of the beach. When he confronted them from afar, shouting across the water, they simply waved and said they were performing coastal inspections. Daniel found it odd. He hadn't requested any, nor had any agency notified him of one. Something felt off. A week later, when Daniel returned after a few days away, he was stunned. A massive construction barge was anchored off the coast. The HOA's logo was plastered across its side. Heavy machinery, crates of supplies, and portable cabins were being unloaded onto his island. They had started construction, without his consent, without notice, without ownership. At first, Daniel thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe the HOA's contractors had mixed up the location. But when he tried to contact their office, no one returned his calls. He sent emails, formal letters, even visited their headquarters. Every attempt was met with polite dismissal or bureaucratic delay. They told him someone would look into it. But no one did. The construction didn't stop. Within 2 months, the once pristine island had been stripped of trees, leveled by bulldozers, and divided into plots. Concrete foundations appeared, followed by metal frameworks. Daniel watched helplessly from his boat as the sound of drills and saws filled the air where there used to be only birds and waves. 15 buildings rose from the ground, identical, sterile, soulless. The HOA had turned the sanctuary into a commercial block, apparently meant for luxury rental units and small offices. They even installed a giant sign near the beach. Clearwater Executive Retreat, an HOA-managed property. Daniel couldn't believe it. They were acting like they owned the island. And according to local gossip, they even began advertising leasing opportunities online, claiming the site was secured under Clearwater Lakes community jurisdiction. It was as if they'd rewritten reality to suit themselves. But what the HOA didn't know, and what Daniel never revealed, was that he had seen this coming. He had anticipated their greed months ago, maybe even years. When the first partnership letters arrived, Daniel hadn't just ignored them. He had begun preparing. Quietly, legally, strategically, he had consulted a real estate attorney, a specialist in property and maritime law. Together, they had reviewed the island's historical ownership and updated the deed, adding specific clauses about trespassing, unpermitted construction, and transfer liability. They'd even registered the island under a holding company to give Daniel additional legal flexibility. And most importantly, Daniel had applied for a private conservation easement through the state, a move that legally protected the land as an ecological zone. That meant any construction or environmental damage done without his explicit approval wasn't just a civil issue. It was a criminal offense. So when the HOA decided to play dirty, Daniel didn't rush to stop them. He let them dig their own grave, one foundation, one steel beam at a time. Every building they raised, every square foot of soil they disturbed, every dollar they poured into construction, it all added to their own liability. He gathered evidence quietly, drone footage, time-stamped photos, paper trails of permits they filed under false pretenses. He collected everything. By the time the HOA had finished all 15 of their gleaming new buildings, Daniel was ready. They walked straight into his legal trap. But Daniel wasn't ready to spring it just yet. Timing was everything. He wanted the HOA to feel comfortable, confident that they had gotten away with it. He wanted them to start making money, to sign leases, to collect payments, to show investors the new expansion. Because once they started generating revenue from his land, the case wouldn't just be about trespassing. It would become a multi-million-dollar fraud and property seizure case. The penalties would be catastrophic. He waited. Then, just when the HOA began hosting ribbon-cutting ceremonies and photo ops, Daniel sent his first move, a certified cease and desist letter, a single document that would ignite a storm. The HOA board received it on a Friday morning. By the weekend, chaos had begun. Because for the first time, they realized they weren't dealing with some naive landowner they could push around. They were dealing with someone who had been several steps ahead, a man who had built his own legal fortress long before they ever set foot on that island. And the best part? They had no idea what was coming next. The letter landed like a grenade in the Clearwater Lakes HOA office. It was clean, concise, and devastatingly formal, outlining, in exact legal language, every violation the association had committed on Daniel Reed's private island. It cited property trespass, unauthorized commercial development, environmental destruction, and fraudulent misrepresentation of ownership. The final paragraph gave them 7 days to cease all operations, vacate the land, and provide financial restitution for damages. The board members panicked. Some thought it was a bluff. Others dismissed it as a mistake. But their panic didn't last long. Arrogance replaced it. The HOA president, a woman named Marcia Klein, had built her career bullying property owners into submission. In her mind, this was no different. She ordered the association's legal department to handle it, confident they could twist the narrative. After all, the HOA had deep pockets, high-level contacts, and an entire network of lawyers used to intimidating homeowners. So instead of responding with compliance, they doubled down. They filed a counterclaim, asserting that Daniel's Island fell within the expansion zone of their newly zoned coastal development area. They attached fake maps, manipulated boundary reports, and even referenced outdated survey documents to make it appear as though Daniel's Island was part of their community. But what they didn't know was that Daniel already had everything prepared to dismantle their lies. Weeks before sending his cease and desist, he had quietly met with county officials, surveyors, and environmental officers. He had ensured that every legal boundary, every zoning record, and every environmental registration for the island was verified and digitally time-stamped. The HOA's fake maps would crumble under even basic scrutiny. Daniel also had drone footage that dated back to before, during, and after construction. Every bulldozer, every shipment, every material offloaded was documented with time, date, and GPS coordinates. The evidence was airtight, a chronological record showing exactly how the HOA had invaded and developed property that wasn't theirs. But Daniel didn't rush to reveal everything. He understood how power worked. The HOA's arrogance was his best weapon. The more they fought back, the more they exposed themselves. When the HOA's attorneys issued a statement claiming ownership rights, Daniel simply forwarded the case to his own legal team, specialists in property fraud and environmental law. Within days, subpoenas were issued to multiple departments. The HOA's building permits were suspended pending investigation. Contractors began receiving calls from state inspectors. Investors grew nervous. The cracks had begun to show. The public caught wind of the situation when a local journalist published an article titled, "HOA accused of building on private island without permission." The story spread like wildfire across social media. Homeowners who had suffered under HOA control were ecstatic. Comment sections were filled with anger, laughter, and satisfaction. For once, the bully was on the receiving end. But the HOA didn't retreat. They couldn't. They had poured millions into the island's development, and pulling out now would mean bankruptcy. So they went on the offensive, publicly accusing Daniel of being a recluse obstructing progress. They painted him as unreasonable, claiming he was exploiting legal loopholes to sabotage community growth. It was a bold move and a foolish one, because Daniel had anticipated this exact reaction. Months earlier, he had registered his holding company as an environmental preservation entity, a nonprofit organization dedicated to coastal conservation. So when the HOA called him selfish, the story flipped again. The media began portraying him as a conservationist, defending natural land from corporate greed. Public sympathy swung heavily in his favor. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the legal war intensified. The HOA's fraudulent documents became their undoing. The county clerk's office found mismatched coordinates and inconsistent timestamps. Their so-called zoning maps were traced back to files that didn't exist in official databases. It was clear they had fabricated evidence. Daniel's attorney presented the findings in court, submitting over 200 pages of proof. He outlined every false permit, every act of trespass, every environmental violation. The court ordered an immediate freeze on all HOA activities on the island. Construction halted overnight. Workers were sent home. The island, once bustling with machinery, fell silent. The half-finished buildings stood like empty shells, monuments to arrogance and deceit. But Daniel wasn't celebrating yet. He knew this was only the beginning. The HOA was powerful, and they had resources. They would appeal, delay, and manipulate until the very end. And he couldn't afford to underestimate them. So while the legal process unfolded, Daniel continued building his case. He began tracing financial records, invoices, payments, and contractor agreements. What he uncovered next was even more damning. The HOA had been diverting funds from homeowner dues to finance the island's construction. That meant every resident under the Clearwater Lakes HOA was unknowingly paying for buildings built on stolen land. The moment this detail leaked, everything changed. Homeowners rebelled. Meetings turned chaotic. Members demanded refunds and resignations. The board fractured internally. Accusations flew. Alliances crumbled. Marcia Klein, the president who once acted untouchable, now faced an internal investigation from her own members. Daniel didn't even need to lift a finger. The HOA was destroying itself. But amid the chaos, Marcia wasn't ready to surrender. Out of desperation, she tried to negotiate privately with Daniel's attorney, offering to buy the island retroactively and legalize the development. She even offered a generous settlement to make the problem disappear. Daniel refused. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about principle, justice, and legacy. The HOA had violated something sacred, and he intended to make sure they faced every consequence. As the case gained more attention, state regulators joined in. Environmental agencies began investigating the ecological damage caused by the construction. Tests revealed contaminated soil, disrupted nesting grounds, and polluted runoff. Each violation carried heavy fines, and all of them fell squarely on the HOA. By the time the second hearing was scheduled, the association was bleeding money, losing credibility, and facing criminal charges for falsified documents. But just when Daniel thought the worst was over, a new twist emerged. One of the contractors, trying to save himself from legal trouble, confessed to something shocking. The HOA hadn't just built commercial buildings. They had buried something, evidence, under one of the concrete foundations before construction ended. Something that could either destroy them completely or change everything Daniel thought he knew about the project. The revelation sent a chill through Daniel. He realized the battle wasn't over yet. It was only evolving. And whatever was hidden beneath those buildings might hold the final piece of the puzzle. The confession came quietly, buried in a stack of legal documents. A contractor's affidavit, submitted as part of a plea for leniency, revealed a single unsettling sentence. The HOA ordered us to bury the initial survey files in some sealed containers under the foundation of Building 6 before final inspection. Daniel stared at those words for a long time. What could possibly be so important or so incriminating that the HOA felt the need to bury it beneath concrete? It wasn't just about hiding records anymore. It was about hiding evidence. The statement was vague, but Daniel's instincts told him it was crucial. Something didn't fit. The HOA's expansion had always seemed rushed, desperate even. Their eagerness to seize the island had gone beyond normal greed. There was something deeper at play, something that made them take risks no rational organization would take. Daniel's lawyer filed an emergency motion requesting limited excavation rights under court supervision. It wasn't an easy process. The HOA's attorneys fought fiercely to block it, arguing that the land was under legal dispute and any interference could compromise structural integrity. But the judge, intrigued by the contractor's sworn statement, granted permission for a controlled inspection. For the first time since the conflict began, Daniel stepped back onto his island, or what was left of it. What had once been an untouched paradise was now scarred and lifeless. The ground was hardened with cement, the air thick with dust. The sound of waves still lapped against the shore, but it no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a whisper of what once was. As workers began carefully removing sections of concrete near Building 6, Daniel watched from a distance. Beneath the layers of rebar and gravel, something metallic glinted faintly under the sunlight. When they cleared away, they found a rust-proof steel lockbox, large, heavy, and sealed tight. It took hours to pry open. Inside was a mess of documents, hard drives, and sealed envelopes marked confidential Clearwater Lakes expansion. The papers weren't just blueprints or contracts. They were internal memos, email printouts, and private communications between HOA officials, developers, and even local zoning officers. As Daniel's legal team reviewed the contents, the truth began to emerge. The island wasn't just chosen for development. It was used as a cover-up. Months before construction began, the HOA had been under federal audit for financial mismanagement. Millions in unaccounted maintenance funds had vanished from their accounts. Investigators had started closing in, demanding explanations. The board needed a way to justify the missing money. So they fabricated a project, a coastal expansion that didn't exist on paper but could be used to shuffle funds. But when Daniel ignored their requests and refused to sell, they changed tactics. They decided to build on his island illegally and retroactively claim ownership, using it as proof that the money had gone into legitimate development. In their arrogance, they believed they could bully the paperwork into compliance later, bribe a few inspectors, forge a few documents, and clean their tracks before anyone noticed. The lockbox held everything: falsified invoices, signatures from complicit contractors, and correspondence detailing how they planned to alter property boundaries. There were even emails between Marcia Klein and a local official discussing how to neutralize the landowner's objections through procedural oversight. In simple terms, it was conspiracy, a corporate cover-up masquerading as development. Daniel realized that his legal trap had caught something far bigger than he'd imagined. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was criminal fraud, involving multiple parties and millions of stolen dollars. His lawyer immediately forwarded the contents to the state prosecutor's office. Within days, investigators descended on the HOA's headquarters. Desks were searched, servers seized, and records confiscated. The story exploded across the news. HOA exposed in multi-million-dollar fraud scandal. Private landowner uncovers hidden evidence on a legal development site. Clearwater Lakes board under criminal investigation. The HOA's board members began resigning one by one. Some fled the state. Others tried to negotiate plea deals. Marcia Klein, once untouchable, was subpoenaed to testify under oath. Her empire was collapsing. But for Daniel, the victory fell hollow. He stood on his ruined island, surrounded by skeletal remains of buildings that should never have existed. The soil was poisoned with cement, the trees gone, the ecosystem disrupted. Years of legal battles had protected his ownership, but not his land. Still, Daniel refused to let it end there. He applied for federal restoration grants, citing environmental damage caused by unlawful development. When officials inspected the site, they were horrified by the extent of destruction. The island had once been classified as a minor ecological habitat, home to nesting seabirds and rare coastal plants. Now, it was a concrete wasteland, but the evidence Daniel provided left no doubt about who was responsible. Soon, the State Environmental Agency filed its own lawsuit against the HOA, this time for environmental crimes. Each building represented a separate count of illegal construction on protected land. Each count carried massive fines and potential jail time. As the months passed, the case widened. Investigations revealed kickbacks, hidden accounts, and shell companies tied to the HOA's leadership. What started as a local property feud had become one of the largest HOA corruption scandals in state history. But while the legal world erupted around him, Daniel kept his focus narrow. He didn't care about fame or revenge anymore. He wanted restoration for the island, for his family's legacy, for the peace that had been stolen from him. He watched as demolition crews began dismantling the illegal buildings under court order. The sound of crumbling concrete echoed across the water, erasing months of greed and arrogance. With every fallen wall, the island began to breathe again. Yet even as progress returned, Daniel couldn't shake one thought. Why had the HOA been so certain they could win? In the lockbox, among the financial records and forged maps, there was one more document, a single letter and signed but stamped with a government seal. It hinted at a secret deal, a land rezoning project that had been quietly proposed years earlier, one that would have reclassified the entire Bay Area, including Daniel's Island, as public development land. If that proposal had gone through, his ownership would have been nullified automatically. Someone powerful had been backing the HOA's plans from the shadows. The fraud may have been exposed, but the motive and the person behind it remained hidden. And as Daniel prepared for another hearing, a quiet realization settled in. This wasn't over. The island wasn't just valuable to the HOA. It was valuable to someone else. Someone who might not stop at legal tactics next time. The battle for the island had just shifted into a deeper, more dangerous game. When the state's investigation into the Clearwater Lakes HOA reached its peak, the news cycles were relentless. Every day brought new revelations, stolen funds, bribed inspectors, falsified permits, environmental crimes. The association's name had become synonymous with corruption. But for Daniel Reed, the deeper mystery was that letter, the one found at the bottom of the lockbox, and signed, marked only with a state-level development seal. It mentioned something called Project Seaside Integration, a proposed initiative to rezone select coastal territories for commercial and governmental partnership. That single phrase changed everything. If such a project existed, it meant the HOA hadn't been acting alone. They had backing, possibly from someone within the state's own planning office. That would explain their confidence, their arrogance, and their willingness to break every law in the book. They weren't just greedy. They believed they were protected. Daniel's attorney began digging into public records, zoning proposals, and state archives. Most of the documents were innocuous, but buried among hundreds of pages of bureaucrat reports, they found it, a draft resolution dated 3 years earlier, proposing new coastal management boundaries. The signature at the bottom was from a man named Edward Langford, a senior official in the Department of Urban and Regional Development. Langford's name wasn't new to Daniel. He'd seen it before on the HOA's correspondence about future expansion zones. Back then, he hadn't thought much of it. Now the connection was obvious. Langford had ties to the HOA board, not officially, but through consulting contracts and private partnerships. He was a hidden hand guiding their actions, using his government position to manipulate zoning data, delay investigations, and legitimize forged documents. In return, he received kickbacks from the HOA's development profits. It was a partnership built on greed and mutual protection. The island, it turned out, had been a crucial piece of a much larger puzzle. Langford's plan had been to convert the entire Clearwater Bay area into a luxury commercial district, marinas, resorts, shopping complexes. The HOA's illegal construction on Daniels Island wasn't an accident. It was a prototype, a proof of concept meant to attract investors and justify rezoning the coastline. But Daniels' legal trap had shattered their timeline. Still, Langford wasn't done. When the fraud scandal broke, he quietly distanced himself, resigning under the guise of retirement. But behind the scenes, he began maneuvering again, trying to salvage what remained of his empire. He had money, influence, and connections that stretched far beyond local jurisdiction. One afternoon, Daniel received a notice from the Department of Coastal Affairs. It stated that due to public infrastructure interests, the state was reviewing the possibility of eminent domain on select coastal lands, including his island. Eminent domain, the government's right to seize private property for public use, the very law that could undo everything he had fought for. Daniel understood instantly. Langford was pulling strings again, this time through official channels. The goal was simple. If they couldn't steal the island through fraud, they would take it legally. But Daniel wasn't the same man he had been a year ago. He was prepared for this. He began gathering every piece of media coverage, every court ruling, and every document proving the HOA's crimes. He built a narrative so strong that no public agency could touch his land without political backlash. Journalists, environmental activists, and property rights advocates rallied to his cause. The island wasn't just a private property anymore. It had become a symbol of resistance against corruption. Soon, national networks picked up the story. Headlines read, "Private landowner faces state threat after exposing HOA fraud." The island that fought back, government under fire for seizure attempt. Public opinion turned fiercely against the state. Langford tried to operate quietly, but the pressure grew. Lawmakers began asking questions. Committees were formed. Hearings were scheduled. Meanwhile, Daniel worked tirelessly with his lawyer to secure a permanent conservation easement on the island, this time at a federal level. It would take months, maybe years, but once approved, it would make his land untouchable. No developer, no corporation, no government office could override it. But Langford was desperate. Documents began disappearing from archives. Witnesses suddenly became unavailable. Anonymous threats appeared in Daniel's email, subtle but unmistakable. Someone didn't want him to keep pushing. Late one night, a small fire broke out on the island. It burned through what was left of Building 3 before firefighters contained it. The cause was ruled electrical malfunction, but there was no power supply on site. Daniel knew it was no accident. It was a message. He didn't stop. The next week, he presented his findings before a state oversight committee. His voice remained calm, his evidence meticulous. He revealed every connection between the HOA and Langford's office, exposing how they'd exploited zoning authority for profit. He showed financial transfers, shell company trails, and even internal memos referencing state cooperation. By the time he was done, the room was silent. The committee launched a formal investigation into Langford and his associates. Search warrants were issued. Bank accounts were frozen. Langford was subpoenaed for questioning. His empire corruption, built over decades, began collapsing just like the HOAs had. The public cheered. Daniel's name became a symbol of accountability, a reminder that even powerful systems could fall when faced with truth and persistence. But beneath the satisfaction, Daniel felt only exhaustion. He returned to his island often, standing where the first illegal foundation had once been. The sea breeze carried a quiet promise of healing. Slowly, vegetation began to return. The scars of concrete faded into soil. It wasn't the same paradise it had once been, but it was his, reclaimed not through wealth or force, but through patience and justice. And yet, one thing still haunted him. During the hearings, one investigator mentioned that several key documents tied to Project Seaside Integration had been removed from the state archives years ago, before Langford's involvement even began. Meaning, someone else had initiated the rezoning concept long before the HOA ever existed. Langford hadn't created the plan. He had inherited it, which begged the question, who had started it, and why had they wanted Daniels Island in particular? The trail led deeper than anyone had imagined, and the answers, Daniel suspected, were still buried somewhere within the history of Clearwater Bay. By the time Edward Langford's corruption case made national headlines, the battle for Daniel Reed's Island had become more than just a legal war. It had become a symbol of justice prevailing over greed. Yet for Daniel, one mystery remained unsolved. The revelation that Project Seaside Integration had existed before Langford's time changed everything. It meant the roots of this conspiracy ran far deeper, beyond the HOA, beyond politics, perhaps even back into the history of the land itself. Daniel knew he couldn't rest until he understood why his island had been targeted so persistently. He began his search where most people wouldn't think to look: the archives of the Clearwater Historical Society. Old maps, survey logs, land records. He pored through decades of documents, tracing ownership transfers, boundary changes, and coastal development plans. The deeper he dug, the clearer a pattern became. In the 1970s, Clearwater Bay had been a modest fishing region. The state had little interest in it until a series of offshore mineral surveys revealed traces of rare earth elements beneath the seabed, minerals used in modern electronics and renewable energy. The discovery had been quietly recorded and shelved, likely to prevent a rush of unregulated mining. But decades later, that information resurfaced, rebranded, restructured, and wrapped in bureaucratic secrecy. Project Seaside Integration wasn't about housing or tourism at all. It was about control of the coastline and the mineral rights beneath it. And Daniels Island, though small, sat directly above the richest section of those deposits. For years, the state had been trying to find a way to rezone the land legally so that private ownership could be overridden. But the problem was the Reed family. Daniel's grandfather had purchased the island long before the surveys existed, and under older property law, that ownership extended not only to the surface but also to the minerals beneath. It explained everything: the HOA's obsession, Langford's manipulation, the secret letter. The island wasn't just valuable for its location. It was worth a fortune buried beneath its soil. Daniel's heart sank as the realization settled in. His family's inheritance had made them targets of a decades-long scheme, one disguised through layers of bureaucracy and false development projects. Determined to confirm his findings, Daniel hired a private research firm specializing in historical land disputes. Weeks later, their report arrived, detailed, precise, and shocking. It revealed that Project Seaside Integration had been first proposed in 1993, long before Langford's tenure. The initiative had originated from a state-backed energy consortium that aimed to secure potential rare mineral zones for future strategic use. To do this discreetly, they had enlisted local development associations, early prototypes of what would later evolve into homeowner associations. The Clearwater Lakes HOA, it turned out, wasn't just a community organization gone rogue. It had been built for this exact purpose: to serve as a proxy for government-controlled land acquisition. Its founding board members were connected to several corporations and state committees that no longer existed, but whose records trace back to the same energy consortium. Langford had merely inherited an old playbook, one that had been in motion for decades. The discovery chilled Daniel. His family's peaceful island had never stood a chance. Every letter, every inspection, every partnership proposal had been part of a slow, calculated plan to force him off the land without triggering suspicion. Yet through patience, caution, and foresight, he had unknowingly dismantled a system that had been operating in secrecy for 30 years. When Daniel's lawyer submitted the historical findings to federal investigators, it sent shockwaves through the state. The case expanded again, this time implicating retired officials, dormant corporations, and land trusts that quietly absorbed millions in public funds for coastal development. Media coverage turned ferocious. Documentaries, exposés, and talk shows began exploring the scandal. Headlines blazed across the nation. The secret industry behind HOA land seizures. Private island owner exposes decades of hidden corruption. Rare minerals found beneath stolen property sparks government inquiry. For the first time, Daniel's struggle was no longer just about his island. It was about the system itself. Homeowners from across the country began coming forward, sharing eerily similar stories of community expansions and mysterious land reclassifications. His fight had awakened a national conversation, but amid all the attention, Daniel stayed focused. He knew media coverage came and went, but evidence endured. He continued gathering records, tracing every shell company tied to the original consortium. Each one led to another, until he reached a name that made him pause: Clearwater Energy Holdings. It was a corporation still active today, quietly operating under an environmental research front. Its executives were untouchable, wealthy, politically connected, shielded by influence. And among its current board members was a familiar name: Marcia Klein. The former HOA president, exposed and humiliated, had resurfaced in a new role. She wasn't ruined. She had simply moved higher up the chain. That revelation made everything click. The HOA had never been her creation. She had been a pawn, rewarded later with a position among those who had orchestrated the entire operation. Her silence was her ticket out of legal ruin. Daniel realized the fight was far from over. He had defeated the visible enemy, but the true architects were still intact, watching from behind corporate walls. And now, by exposing them, he had made himself a direct threat. Security cameras began malfunctioning at his coastal home. Drones hovered at a distance near his property. Anonymous letters warned him to let the past rest. But Daniel had come too far to turn back. He prepared for the next phase, one not fought in local courts or state hearings, but in federal litigation. With his attorney's guidance, he began drafting a case that would accuse Clearwater Energy Holdings of orchestrating systematic property fraud and environmental conspiracy. It would be a massive multi-agency undertaking, one that could take years. Still, Daniel felt no fear. If his family's legacy had survived decades of deceit, it could survive a few more battles. As he stood on the shore one evening, watching the sun set over his island, he thought of his grandfather, the man who had once told him that the sea remembers everything. The waves whispered softly against the sand, as if agreeing. The island had been violated, scarred, and nearly stolen, yet remained. And now, its story was finally being told. But Daniel knew there was still one last chapter left, the confrontation that would decide everything. The people who had hidden in the shadows for decades would soon be forced into the light. And when that happened, justice would either triumph completely or disappear forever. Months passed since the scandal broke. But for Daniel Reed, the storm had only shifted forms. What had begun as a property dispute had evolved into one of the most complex legal showdowns in state history. And now, the battle had reached its final act. The federal investigation into Clearwater Energy Holdings had grown into a sprawling web of subpoenas, audits, and interviews. Every document Daniel had uncovered, every contract, every recorded conversation, every boundary survey, was now evidence. And yet, despite the mountain of proof, the corporation's lawyers moved with frightening precision. They were relentless, well-funded, and unafraid to twist the narrative. They claimed Daniel had fabricated documents, tampered with records, and staged the HOA's collapse for personal profit. Their goal was simple: bury him under paperwork and drag the case out until exhaustion did what corruption couldn't. But Daniel had anticipated this. Long before the hearings began, he had placed every shred of verified evidence in the hands of multiple independent watchdog groups and investigative journalists. Even if someone silenced him, the truth was already beyond reach. The first court hearings drew national attention. Crowds lined the courthouse steps. Journalists swarmed the entrances, and online forums buzzed with speculation. Some called Daniel a hero. Others dismissed him as a reckless property owner who had bitten off more than he could chew. But when the prosecution began laying out its timeline, a detailed map of 30 years of deceit, the public's perception shifted. They showed how the Clearwater Lakes HOA had been formed under the guise of community development, how it had quietly been funded by shell companies linked to state contractors, how zoning maps had been subtly redrawn to exclude private ownership, then corrected after land was absorbed. Piece by piece, the web unraveled. Emails, financial records, and notarized minutes connected Clearwater Energy Holdings directly to the HOA's founding charter. Even the name Project Seaside Integration, appeared in internal memos dated years before Langford ever held office. Every secret Daniel had unearthed became part of a story too large to suppress. The defense tried to pivot, claiming ignorance, deflecting blame, painting Langford and the HOA as independent bad actors. But it was too late. The truth had momentum. Meanwhile, the public backlash grew fierce. Former HOA members in other states came forward with eerily similar accounts. Entire communities began auditing their association funds, uncovering misused development grants and unapproved construction deals. What began as Daniel's personal revenge had ignited a national reckoning. For the first time, the power dynamic shifted. Ordinary homeowners began questioning the unchecked authority of HOAs, and lawmakers were forced to act. New oversight bills were proposed, Transparency Acts drafted, and task forces established to investigate private-to-public land transitions. But amid the chaos, Daniel remained quiet. He didn't attend every hearing. He didn't give interviews or chase the spotlight. He focused on one thing, ensuring the final verdict was beyond manipulation. When the last phase of the trial arrived, Clearwater Energy Holdings faced a mountain of charges: fraudulent zoning activity, unlawful land seizure, and long-term environmental misconduct. And then, in a moment that stunned the courtroom, Edward Langford himself took the stand. The disgraced official, once protected by arrogance and wealth, now looked like a hollow-shelled man he had been. He spoke quietly, almost brokenly, as he described how he'd been drawn into the system, how Project Seaside Integration wasn't his creation, but something inherited from higher powers who demanded obedience. He confessed that when Daniel began his legal trap, the board panicked. The construction of the 15 commercial buildings had been a desperate move to solidify ownership before Daniel could expose their fraud. It was meant to intimidate him into surrender, but instead, it had triggered the downfall of everyone involved. By the time Langford finished speaking, the courtroom was silent. The mask had been ripped off, and the rod exposed for everyone to see. The verdict came weeks later. Clearwater Energy Holdings was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. Several executives were sentenced to long prison terms, including Langford, who received one of the harshest sentences in state history. Marcia Klein, the former HOA president, was indicted on charges of document falsification and obstruction of justice. She, too, would face years behind bars. But for Daniel, justice wasn't measured in jail sentences. It was measured in silence. The silence of construction that no longer echoed across his island. The silence of officials who had once harassed him, now stripped of their titles. The silence of a coastline restored to peace, free from the machinery of greed. He returned to the island months after the verdict, greeted by the sound of waves and the whisper of wind through the palm trees. The scars left behind by the bulldozers had begun to heal. Nature was reclaiming what had been taken. Daniel walked the length of the shore, his footsteps sinking into the sand where the commercial buildings had once stood. Only foundations remained, empty, forgotten, soon to be swallowed by grass and tide. He stopped near the old dock, where he had once stood years ago, reading the first notice from the HOA. The journey had begun there, with confusion, anger, and disbelief. Now it ended with clarity. The island had survived every assault. It had witnessed deceit, corruption, and greed, but it had also borne witness to justice. In the months that followed, Daniel quietly transferred the island's ownership into a permanent conservation trust, a legal mechanism that would prevent anyone from ever developing it again. It would remain untouched, protected, and free. When reporters later asked why he didn't sell it or build on it himself, he simply told them that some places weren't meant to be owned, only safeguarded. The world eventually moved on. New scandals, new stories. But for those who remembered, the legend of the island that fought back remained a symbol, a warning to every corrupt system that thought it could take what wasn't theirs. Daniel spent his days away from courts and headlines, writing quietly, recording the story of what had happened, not as a legal case, but as a testament to endurance. He wanted others to know that justice wasn't instant. It was slow, deliberate, and often lonely, but when it arrived, it was absolute. Years later, as he watched the sunset cast golden light across the waves, Daniel smiled for the first time in a long while. The sea that had once been a battlefield was now calm again. The legal trap had worked. The truth had prevailed, and for the first time since it all began, the island was finally free.